Yeah, I don't think that it's out there.
So, when she said back behind Sam's,
There was an Arthur.
I wasn't either until Tuesday.
Right.
It's not like the drywood. That's
Right, when are they? Yeah.
Sounds about right.
Popular to have that in the back part. Actually have that kind of.
Yeah, really. Yeah.
They kind of forget. Yeah, I got you. Yeah, I knew he was there. Never know. It's hard.
Tying that stuff.
All the way to go up there to go deer hunt, and we had a paint point in our
Yeah, that's what I heard it say down here.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's just, you would think.
Is it
Yeah.
does it feel strange
No, no,
sitting in
it's-
this spot?
Yeah. He was looking at me like I thought I didn't care. Oh, okay. No, I do live in
Yeah, I was sure the law was the happier if I just
They're a big year away from
You want us to show it in the slide on this?
Yeah, I'll show you the videos there.
He was.
He sounds like that. That should be foreign policies and great power.
He just, we loved when when he got up, we were like, he's gonna put us to sleep.
That's how this guy I with a sheet of paper. Put it down, light up a cigarette. And he's, I need to read manuscript.
Well, good evening. Thank you for coming out tonight. I had absolutely no idea how many might show up or who might show up, but yeah, as a denomination, we've been in an interesting period of time. Like all the world, we've had to deal with the pandemic, but then also we've had some of our own controversy going on in the midst of the denomination, and so Jack and I have been talking for the last few weeks. He and I did attend a meeting that the bishop held up in Zelienople with a number of churches that are investigating the possibility of disaffiliating. And so we thought it might be good to share some information here. for transparency so that you know what's going on and know what options are available and what things to think about. I want to start out tonight first with a word of prayer and then share a little bit about my history so that you know the lens I'm looking at this through. Let us pray. Gracious God, we ask for your Spirit to be present. Help us to enter into this time as we think about the matters that are going on within the church and what those may mean for us, and what you may be calling us to do in our pathway into the future. Personally, Lord, I pray for your guidance tonight. The words I share will be helpful and help people to understand and to come to decisions if decisions are to be made. I pray, Lord, that you would give me the right words. In your Spirit I pray. Amen. So I have been a pastor for 32 years. This is my 33rd year in full-time ministry. Prior to that, I'd been 3 years an associate pastor while I was going through seminary in a church over in Columbus, Ohio. I've gotten to do ministry in a variety of settings, some urban small-town kind of settings, rural church setting. Now here, I'm not sure what we really classify you at this point. You know, a couple decades ago, this would have been a rural setting, pretty sure, but now it's kind of a little bit different with all the areas that have grown up near and around us. So that kind of changes the setting a little bit. In terms of some leadership experience, some of you know these pieces, some of you may not. I have, in 32 years of completed ministry, have spent 30 of those in denominational and annual conference leadership positions. I served for a few years as the chair of finance for the annual conference, served as the director of operations, which was really basically a vice chair position, if you will, for our hosting of the 2004 General Conference here in Pittsburgh. Have served as chair of the Conference Relations Committee on the Board of Ministry, and also served as Conference Sessions Team Chair, which oversees the process of putting the meeting together for the annual conference each year in June. I have gotten to be in those leadership positions in a number of places to move us in future directions in a variety of ways. While I was chair of finance, moved us from a large IBM mainframe computer system into a network of desktop computers. We also, in that season, adopted a new formula for the apportionments, and that formula just got replaced about 2 years ago. So that work that I had shepherded through lasted for about 22, 23 years. In conference relations position with the Board of Ministry, of course, we dealt with pastors going on leave of absence. We also dealt with potential charges that may be brought against a pastor and some things such as that. We also dealt with some term. Mine just went absolutely blank. Basically, a leave of absence not desired by the individual, but one that was being mandated on them as to the process. And so, got to walk through a number of very personal and private kinds of situations in that setting, and help persons through those times. As they discerned where ministry was leading them in the future. And then conference sessions was a part of moving the annual conference from meeting at Grove City to meeting in Erie now. And of course, during my season of chairing was when we were also dealing with the pandemic, and so it's like 19 was a normal meeting, 20 was a One day online meeting, and 21 was a hybrid meeting of the two, and then 22 finally came back into a normal season. So I had nothing normal about dealing with that. Then there was also 8 years in the middle of that where I served on the general staff of the General Council on Finance and Administration. It is one of the 13 general agencies of the United Methodist Church that works at the global level of the church. At the time I went on staff, we were in the process of moving that agency from Evanston, Illinois to Nashville, Tennessee. And one of the things that my particular position had multiple features to it. That means a job description that went on forever and at the bottom said, and all other duties as assigned. Some of you have had job descriptions like that. And one of the things that one of my primary responsibilities was to serve as the business manager of the General Conference. And so I was the lead event planner for making the 2008 and 2012 General Conferences happen. That means making arrangements for hotel, housing, food, travel for the delegates to get there from around the world. In those 2 years, we were close to 1,000 delegates for each of those general conferences, with about 42% of the delegates coming from outside of the United States. So dealing with visa issues, we prepared all the advanced materials in English, French, and Portuguese. Now they also do Swahili as the primary languages representing the majority of the delegates. And then in person, the interpretation done by interpreters was actually done in not only French and Portuguese, but also Spanish, German, Russian, Mandarin Chinese, Korean, American Sign Language. So, saying all of that, that was about a $10 million to $12 million meeting. That happened once every 4 years, with the exception of 2020 because of the pandemic, and now been rescheduled several times. I share some of that information partly because we also know that the 2020 General Conference not only didn't happen, but got postponed 2 or 3 times. Now we're looking at 2024 simply as the next meeting of the General Conference. There still is a case before the Judicial Council to determine whether this is a postponed 2020 or actually the 2024, and we just kind of skipped the 2020. I know on the surface, for the average person, that it's like, what's the big deal? Well, one of the things that it speaks to is, for instance, all the legislation that had already been received for the 2020. Is it still valid, or must it be resubmitted? Are all the delegates who were elected for the 2020 still the delegates for the next meeting, or should there be new elections going on? So there are some important decisions that come out of that Judicial Council decision that I would expect probably will come somewhere in the next couple of weeks that will shape some of the actions that happen between now and the next meeting of the General Conference. It's important to have some of that understanding as well, to understand how we got where we are and some of the pathways forward that we potentially can look at. One of the approaches that has always been important in my ministry in presenting any kind of thing like this, where there are very diverse viewpoints, is to try to find measured ways to present that in the most even way possible. If we were doing a several-week session, for instance, I at that point would probably show you 6 videos by Rob Renfro, who is one of the spokespersons for the conservative side of the church, and would give you a very clear view of the way in which many of the conservative viewpoints are being understood and why they see the action of moving into global Methodist Church as necessary. And on the other hand, to counterbalance it, 6 videos by Adam Hamilton, who would speak on the progressive side, actually in response to some of the things that Rob has had to say, as one way of looking at it as a balanced possibility of understanding. Is one of the things I've learned across the years is there's my truth, and there's your truth, and your truth, and your truth, and your truth. And that tells us that ultimately the truth is probably not with any one of us, but sits somewhere in between. And so that's why I find it helpful to be able to try to hear those divergent voices. Knowing that we were not going to be here until midnight tonight, at least that's not my plan, I went looking for videos, trying to find just a couple of videos that might really kind of help paint some of the picture of what's going on. And the problem I found is that most of them are either from the left or the right, and so it's going to be shaped through that. But I did find one piece that actually, it's not bad, and was kind of surprising. It's a Fox News piece. And so I want to share that. This would have been done, it didn't have a date on it, so I don't know the exact date, but based on the history of what she shares, it would be probably in May of this year is when I believe that newscast would have been. No.
Sarah, a group that represents the denomination meets every 4 years for the General Conference to vote and rule on what is added to or subtracted from the Book of Discipline, which is the law and doctrine the church follows. But there are certain issues that the church is torn on and that even a vote can't seem to fix.
But the church at large.
Jeff Gage is a senior pastor at Lanes Chapel United Methodist Church in Tyler. Gage grew up in the United Methodist Church, which was formed the same year he was born.
There's no easy short answer in any of this, and it is sad.
Everything happening within the church hits close to home for Gage, but this isn't a new problem.
It goes back many, 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 many years. I mean, some would argue that this was a little bit of a problem baked into the denomination when it started in 1968.
The Methodist Church is conflicted about how their congregation will move forward. The politics of everyday life are present in the church, separating members on their religious beliefs.
There began a push to include individuals who practice homosexuality to ordain them as clergy.
A divided issue the UMC voted on at the General Conference a few years ago.
In 2019, there was a special session of General Conference that was going to hopefully settle the matter once and for all.
But when it came down to the vote,
it came down that we were going to keep the Book of Discipline the same and still not ordain those who practice homosexuality and not celebrate homosexual unions with marriages in our churches.
But the members who are supportive of the LGBTQ plus community felt that something needed to change. So there was a call for a revote in 2020, but then the pandemic hit, delaying the General Conference again and again until 2024.
We were notified that General Conference will not meet again this year, but it will be delayed to 2024.
However, this disagreement goes beyond views of sexual orientation.
You can pick any number of issues, that being one or two, that there's just going to be a wide divergence of belief within the church on that. And that divergence has just gotten to a degree where we're not united anymore.
For many of these churches, like Lanes Chapel, for example, the people don't own the property, the denomination does. So if members decide to stop being United Methodists, they're forced to vacate the premises. Now, this is one of the many issues that makes a clean split so difficult.
Well, there was people talking and planning, how can we part ways and allow churches to keep their facilities without dragging it through the court systems. Because if you look at the Episcopal Church, the Lutheran Church, they went through that and it has cost untold dollars.
Amid the conflict, a conservative and traditionalist group was forming behind the scenes.
The Global Methodist Church said, we're going to go online, we're going to start May 1st, and anyone, pastor or church, who wants to align with the Global Methodist Church is welcome to align.
Members have several options. They might align with the Global Methodist Church, choose a new denomination, become independent, or stay with the United Methodist Church.
There would be a traditionalist church form, and then there would be a post-separation United Methodist Church that would become more progressive.
But separate is the only way members feel they can move forward peacefully.
There are going to be conferences across the U.S. where there will be a resolution or a vote. Okay, can we as a conference, or can churches within our conference join the Global Methodist Church without a long, drawn-out church fight?
Ranga says churches on both sides are trying to proceed with caution and avoid a legal battle.
But it's really something that historically has evolved and changed over time and built up, and it's an accumulation of a lot of things that have led us to this point, in addition to a lot of delays and not addressing and resolving some of the differences.
There are additional problems which emerge from this split, including exit costs, property rights, pensions, and missions.
Nobody's going to win in this. It's sad.
Divided and ununited. The Judicial Council met this week, which is a version of the Supreme Court for the Methodist Church. They ruled that the annual conference in the U.S. cannot disaffiliate from the UMC as a single entity. Churches will still be leaving the UMC in the future. This decision only changes the path and timeline of those exits. Reporting in studio, Katie Pratt, Fox 51 News.
And she's actually out of Houston. I caught the ticker tape across the bottom to realize that. So there's a few things that she picked up on. Actually, as I said, it was a pretty balanced report that she shared and the information she gave. A little bit of inaccuracy in understanding some of the polity issues. For instance, the property is not owned by the conference. It is owned by the local church, but it is in trust to the denomination. And so that is one of the issues that the whole disaffiliation conversation has also been trying to work with and trying to resolve as well. One of the things she talked about, or the one pastor she was interviewing talked about, was some of the problem being baked in. And this also points to her comment. We were not born in 1968 as a denomination. We did have a merger in 1968, but we all know that we're a much older denomination than that. So it's kind of funny to hear how that got portrayed a little bit. But what's being referenced to there is the merger of the Evangelical United Brethren Church and the Methodist Church. When that merger was done, one of the things that did not happen was that there was no redrafting of what our foundational documents would be. Instead, simply the Confession of Faith of the Evangelical United Brethren Church and the Articles of Faith of the Methodist Church were simply laid side by side to say these are our guiding documents. Well, there are some fine differences between them, and they represent some of the theological understanding. So that is not the reason why we are solely here, but that's certainly one of the issues that comes to play, is that because we never worked out a common theological understanding right to begin with within the merger, I think we've set ourselves up for part of this journey now, where we're identifying that maybe it was too divergent. I remember as a kid in the 60s and 70s growing up and hearing one of the language pieces that was used to describe the United Methodist Church was that it was a big tent theology. By that meaning that we have a broad width of theology that's accepted within the denomination. Well, perhaps it got too wide. And so now what you find is that there are There are certainly persons to the further ends on both sides of the line who are looking at the other end of the line saying that's too much, that's too far. So that's part of where we are. The next two videos I want to share, the first one's a little bit longer, second one is much shorter. Features Lovett Weems. Lovett Weems is a professor at Wesley Seminary in Washington, D.C. He's also one of the key leaders in their Lewis Center for Leadership, and been around for a long time. He's pretty respected across the board, and he shares a little bit of deeper history in terms of General Conference actions, even going back into the 1800s, that kind of help inform some of how we've gotten to where we are as well. And so this video would have been done prior to the 2020 General Conference when it was supposed to happen. And then the second video I'll show will kind of update since that conference did not happen.
Let's begin with a shorthand version of how the United Methodist Church got to its current dilemma about human sexuality before exploring options for the future. The first public debate on homosexuality came at the 1972 General Conference. There was a proposal to include in the social principles these words: homosexuals, no less than heterosexuals, are persons of sacred worth. To which the conference added these additional words: though we do not condone the practice of homosexuality and consider this practice incompatible with Christian teaching. Subsequent General Conference actions included not recognizing same-sex marriage in 1976, saying, we do not recognize a relationship between two persons of the same sex as constituting marriage. Also in 1976, there was a ban on the use of church funds to promote the acceptance of homosexuality. In 1984, ordination was addressed, saying, self-avowed practicing homosexuals are not to be accepted as candidates ordained as ministers or appointed to serve in the United Methodist Church. In 1996, clergy were forbidden to celebrate homosexual unions, nor could the ceremonies be held in United Methodist churches. Then in 2016, the General Conference asked the Council of Bishops to appoint a commission to bring a proposal to a special General Conference to be held in February 2019. The Commission on the Way Forward did their work and brought to the special session 3 plans. In addition to the one church plan supported by most of the bishops, there were 2 other proposals submitted: the Connectional Conference Plan and the Traditional Plan. The one church plan recognized diverse theological and scriptural understandings, removed negative and restrictive language about homosexuality, and required no annual conference, bishop, congregation, or pastor to act contrary to their convictions. The Connectional Conference Plan created 3 values-based connectional conferences: traditional, unity, and progressive, with each having its own book of discipline. Conferences and churches decide which connectional conference to join. The Traditional Plan strengthened current language of the discipline concerning human sexuality, increased sanctions and punishments, and provided a process for those who cannot live within the discipline to leave. There was also a 4th plan on which the General Conference voted. The Simple Plan removed all negative and restrictive language regarding homosexuality as the policy for everyone. So what happened at the 2019 Special General Conference? The Traditional Plan passed 438 to 384, a 53% majority, Persons on both sides of the debate seem to agree that among the delegates from the United States, approximately 2/3 favored the one church plan instead of the traditional plan. However, there were enough votes for the traditional plan among the central conferences outside the U.S. to defeat the one church plan and pass the traditional plan. Remember, it was the traditional plan that keeps the current church positions on homosexuality with additional sanctions and punishments for violations. Let's look now at approaches people are advocating given the 2019 vote. 5 broad approaches revolve around governance issues, strengthening current positions, rejection and resistance, a church division with one side leaving, and disillusion. Some believe that, quite apart from homosexuality, important governance issues have come to light through this debate. One set of reforms would give the United States standing that permits it to shape policies that fit in our context, even as central conferences outside the U.S. now can do. Then there is the larger debate over the role of General Conference in relationship to annual conferences. Annual conferences are older than the General Conference. There were 12 annual conference sessions before the Christmas conference met. Then annual conferences continued to meet until the annual conferences created the General Conference in 1792. In Methodism, the annual conference is the basic body of the church. For example, the annual conference is the only body that decides who is ordained. This right has never been delegated to bishops, seminaries, or the General Conference. However, many see the General Conference assuming more power over issues belonging to the annual conferences. Some advocate a far more circumscribed role for the General Conference, with more decisions left to annual conferences and local churches. A second type of response is to support the General Conference actions and take them further through strengthening current restrictions and adding more punishments. Some plan to modify and resubmit a series of measures previously ruled unconstitutional, even as they monitor compliance with current sanctions. A third approach is to reject, resist, and advocate for change. This has been the most common route used when a General Conference action lacks enough credibility within the church to be accepted without further debate. Here are a few historical examples of clergy, laity, bishops, and annual conferences rejecting through their action legislation passed by the General Conference. Clergy between 1884 and 1928 who performed a marriage for a divorced person with a living former spouse. Clergy between 1880 and 1968 who smoked. The Kansas, Minnesota, Nebraska, Pittsburgh, and Rock River annual conferences in 1888 when they elected women to General Conference. Churches in the 1960s that refused admittance to African American worshipers. And today, clergy who practice rebaptism, as well as churches that refuse to receive a clergywoman or a pastor of another race. All these actions were or are forbidden by the discipline at the time. A fourth response to controversial actions has been for the church to divide, with one side leaving to form a new church. This chart shows that such divisions have occurred in our history. The chart shows the year, the issue, and the new church formed. Here you can see on the left a compilation of the issues over which these church splits occurred, primarily race. Not only do some issues recur, some divisions were on both sides of an issue. In the right column, you see other divisive issues over which the church has not divided. A fifth and new course some advocate is a dissolution of the United Methodist Church and then everyone chooses from 2 or 3 new denominations. This is the most complex, confusing, and convoluted of the options. If even possible, it would take years to accomplish and probably countless legal obstacles. However, this option appears to be supported by those most anxious to separate from those with whom they disagree, based partly on the assumption that this vehicle gives them a better chance of garnering more churches to their cause than merely leaving themselves and inviting other churches to follow. So what's next for the United Methodist Church? I've been reading lately about 3 things: Methodism's history with slavery and race, the breakup of the church between North and South in 1844, and the quarter-century of proceedings leading to North and South reuniting in 1939. I've been struck by the absence of serious biblical, theological, and historical engagement with the issues at stake. I fear the same today. Notice how seldom you hear the words of Jesus and John Wesley quoted. Another observation is that when the wisdom of God on an issue was manifestly not apparent to everyone, the default mode was not to give more time to discern God's will, but rather to turn to their social and political preferences as if it were God's will. Here's something I came across reading about my home conference of Mississippi as the church was splitting between North and South. Here's how a pastor described the division. Remember, he supported the position of the South and felt the division was inevitable. The whole church was convulsed from center to circumference. The mind of the church was filled with this unprecedented disaster. To this writer, it was the darkest day he had ever seen. This ruinous convulsion exploded in the General Conference in May and June, and the entire portion of the year usually devoted to efforts to save souls was taken up with this humiliating and much to be deplored disaster to our glorious church. It is a fearful thing to rend the body of Christ. Sometimes people ask me if any group has dealt with these issues successfully. Yes, there is. I find virtually all United Methodist congregations have found a way to deal with differing opinions without splitting or even hindering the Lord's work. I've not met a church member yet who wants another member of their church who disagrees with them put out of the church. And few church members, if any, are interested in telling another church what they can or can't do. At the General Conference level, the debate is driven by the 10 to 15% on either extreme who can hardly bear being in a church where people disagree with them at this moment about homosexuality. Sure, others vote with them because they share their stance on homosexuality. But the crucial difference is that the 70% may differ on homosexuality, but none of them wants to push anyone out of the church and certainly don't want their church dissolved. The largest group in almost all annual conferences today is either traditionalists for one church or progressives for one church. I recently asked clergy and laity attending an annual conference if their current church was established prior to their birth. Virtually all were. That's a good reminder that we and our current opinions are not the center of the universe. Most of what United Methodism has achieved was done long before we were on the scene. We dare not trifle with this pearl of great price. We desperately need to find a way to honor conscience and still live together until that day, and I'm confident it will come when God's wisdom for the future is more clearly revealed. If some cannot abide this diversity, departure is an honorable decision, but bringing chaos to thousands of churches who don't share such certainty and impatience is not. None of us should try to take a denomination or annual conferences with us. They are not ours to take. Our unity has never been and can never be based on anything but Jesus Christ. In Christ we trust that in due season we shall see more fully what is now seen only dimly.
And then this is the response, or the update that he did. I think that was actually earlier this year.
Many appear to see the postponement of the General Conference to 2024 as a bad thing. It may be, but chances are just as great that it will be a good thing. Time seems to help when we seek to discern God's will on difficult issues. John Wesley's last sermon, preached 1 week before his death, was from Isaiah 55:6. Seek ye the Lord while he may be found. Call ye upon him while he is near. You recognize this passage from a portion of Isaiah critically influential for New Testament Christians struggling to understand the unfolding meaning of the coming of Christ for their lives. Our human need for control often resists the need to call upon the Lord and wait for the veil of uncertainty to lift. Our need for certainty invariably outruns our waiting and prayerful discernment. Are decisions now, when we see in a mirror dimly, better than waiting? Let's look back at some pivotal moments in Methodist history to see. For example, what if the 1844 Methodist Episcopal General Conference, in which Methodism split north and south, had been postponed? Does anyone think that after the nation divided over slavery, over 600,000 died in a war about slavery, and slavery was outlawed, that the church would have divided for the formation of a more slavery-accommodating denomination? Or what if the 1939 Uniting Conference that approved a racially segregated church structure had been postponed to 1969? Does anyone think that in 1969 Methodism would have established a segregated jurisdiction for African Americans? Some talk about the anguish and uncertainty of delays. It depends on your perspective. What about the anguish in 1939 of the 47 African American General Conference delegates that all voted against the exclusionary plan or abstained? When the conference rose to sing in celebration, "We are marching to Zion," those 47 delegates remained seated. Some wept, including one of the most admired Methodists of her time, Mary McLeod Bethune. People on differing sides seem to consider this time of delay as a time of such uncertainty that it immobilizes energy for mission. Some disaffiliating churches said the debate had become a distraction from their mission. Really? Churches are likely to be distracted from their mission when their leaders are. Most churches put mission far ahead of issue debates. After the turmoil of the 2019 General Conference spread rapidly, some bishops immediately scheduled meetings to hear concerns. At one event, a bishop asked the laity and clergy gathered what had happened in their churches in the 2 weeks since the General Conference. After some silence, people told many stories of their continuing ministries, but not even one had let the recent actions of General Conference delegates keep them from their mission task. Ministry goes on, and pandemics, authoritarian regimes, and atrocities of war have a way of putting into perspective our denominational struggles. Yes, in these present moments, I think time is helping many United Methodists put things in a broader view. Even some whose views align with those calling for division recognize the difference between what they are hearing and the grace-filled, loving, and open Methodism they cherish. It's not that the contentious issues of today are not important. They matter, but are not the heart of what Jesus taught. John Wesley always feared that secondary things would overshadow Wesley's abiding passion that all come to know the love of God revealed in Christ. I pray that we attune ourselves now to the grace of Jesus Christ and to Wesley's passion for spreading that good news to all.
It is not lost on me that as we're sitting here on this end of the building, talking about what we're talking about and hearing what we're hearing, at the same time we're hearing on the other end of the building Skywalker Ministries doing a play and pray tonight. And I think that's a part of the point that Lovett makes very well, is that the reality is that regardless of what name we are known by, we have a job to do right here, right in the midst of our own community, seeking to spread the good news of Jesus Christ. And that should always be our first and primary focus. So I want to talk a little bit about paragraph 2553, excuse me. This is, if you have a 2016 book of discipline, how many of you own a 2016 book of discipline? Do you know that if that question were asked 50 years ago, about half of you would actually own your own copy? That was common. Yeah, some old ones probably got from your parents. Yeah, that's, again, I think that's part of what I look at as a part of that whole scale of how denominationalism has changed, is that we don't own it in the same way that we used to. I'm going to back up and give you just a little bit more history piece on me personally. 1988, I attended General Conference in St. Louis, Missouri, as a seminary student. I believe in that year I got to see some of the best and the worst of Methodism happen all at the same time as various issues were debated. But one of the things that was the outcome of that General Conference was the approval of this hymnal, which was the first and so far only hymnal of the United Methodist Church, because the previous hymnals were of the two separate denominations that merged in 1968. In 2000, I attended General Conference at Cleveland, Ohio, as an observer on behalf of Western Pennsylvania Conference to see what it would take for us to do the hosting in 2004, which I also attended in Pittsburgh. And then partly as a result of that work is how I ended up in the right place at the right time for becoming the business manager for the 2008 and 2012. The 2016 General Conference I got to watch online from the comfort of my easy chair as I was texting with some of our delegates. And so it was kind of an interesting conversation back and forth as watched that unfold. And then the 2019 special session I did attend, that was also in St. Louis, different facility. I think the facility that we'd been in 88 had been torn down. And got to see that rather contentious General Conference. And again, going back to the newsreel piece where the one pastor said, nobody wins, that's what it felt like that at that General Conference, that nobody won. The interesting thing is, and you won't hear it all get completely painted this way, so I will say that you will find some opinions that might not match mine about this. 2553 is a book of discipline passage that I asked why, if you owned a copy of the 2016, which is the last printed the book of discipline, is because it's not in there. Because it was approved at the 2019 General Conference. So it's on an addendum sheet to the 2016. It is on. Turn me up then, because it's on. All right. Yeah, I can hear the difference now too, so I don't know if I had a loose wire on it or what the issue was, but the 2019 General Conference, the plans that Lovett talked about in that first video, the one that actually came as the recommended one was the one church plan, which would have the 3 houses in it. And that, there ended up being a substitute motion that was made on the floor that put the traditional plan into that mix instead as the recommended plan. And then that was the action that was ultimately approved. As a part of that, a separate piece of legislation, but once that movement was done, then 2553 was put forward as a way for churches to leave who were unhappy around these issues. Now, it was predominantly the conservative side that was putting it forward, thinking of it in terms of the progressive churches leaving. But now it's swung the other way, that it's actually, it's more the conservative side that is, although there are also still some progressive churches that are choosing to leave in this season as well. And in those cases, most of those are probably at the further end of being progressive, that are choosing to leave. So let's talk a little bit about what this paragraph says. First is that it's time limited. It has a sunset clause, which is a very unusual thing for Methodists. Typically, when we put a rule in place, it's in place until whoever's authorized to change it changes it again. And so this rule, this particular paragraph of the Book of Discipline, sunsets on December 31st in 2023. Now, the expectation was that they would have the 2020 General Conference. There would be some tweaking of language, and they would find the next step now that it was already in place. Well, that meeting hasn't happened. So that's, again, a part of the fabric of how we've gotten where we are today. Church conference. This is the action of disaffiliation is a vote of the church conference, which means every professing member of the church has a vote in that. It is a secret ballot vote, and 67% approval is required in order for a motion to disaffiliate to be approved. Now, you don't get there right away. We've got some other steps to go to before you get to that kind of a resolution. What I can tell you is that it's been all over the board in churches that have already begun these votes as to where they come out. Some that have been a very large landslide in favor of, others that simply did not make the 67% threshold. In fact, actually recently I talked with one pastor in our district that said they've already done a soft canvassing of their congregation and have kind of come to realize that they're pretty much at a 50-50 split, which means that you're not going to prove it, but it also means that you potentially are tearing the church apart. And so that's also one of the dangers of this kind of a process. Standard terms. One of the directions of paragraph 2553 was for the General Council on Finance and Administration. That's the body I work with. That's where the legal department is for the denomination is held. And so they were asked to provide a set of standard terms, in other words, a contract, if you will, for disaffiliation, so that the same language is being used across the whole United Methodist Church, not every annual conference doing their own contract. And so there is a standard, it's about an 8-page document that lays out all the standard terms, and most of it is boilerplate lawyer language. I worked with some of those lawyers, I'm used to their language, and yeah, it's boilerplate lawyer language. What those terms is simply the language of the contract, if you will, and it's a fill in the blank, and then that's the contract then that gets used by every annual conference. The Last point I want to make on this page is that there is annual conference approval required as well. So any churches that are doing a disaffiliation vote at this point, sometime either at their next annual conference in May or June, or in some annual conferences they are doing special called sessions, there will be actions taken to approve those disaffiliations. Cost of disaffiliation. Yes, there is a cost. No such thing as a free lunch, is what I remember learning in economics class. So the cost of disaffiliation is the first two are set by paragraph 2553. So these would be the same across every annual conference. That one, you have to pay the current year's apportionments leading into the disaffiliation. So if you're doing a disaffiliation in 2023, it would be that the past year has to have been paid in full, and then you would pay one more year beyond that date of disaffiliation. The second one is a pro rata share of current pension liability. Any of you benefits experts? Good, you won't know what I'm talking about then. I'm going to give you a little bit of lesson in benefits because it's important just to understand some of the concepts, because again, you'll hear different people say different things about this that aren't necessarily speaking from a body of factual knowledge to understand it. In the pension world, there are basically two kinds of pensions. There's a defined benefit pension, a defined contribution pension. Some of you were in church leadership back in the 90s when I first came into ministry, when you paid 12% of the pastor's salary to the Board of Pensions. That was a defined contribution that you paid a percentage of, or a certain dollar amount. It was a defined contribution. A defined benefit was, for instance, the pre-1982 plan in the United Methodist Church was for each month of service, you receive a certain dollar credit for your pension. So if you've got 30 years of service times 12 months, times the percentage, and then it's based on denominational average compensation for clergy. That's what gives you that figure as a defined benefit. So pre-82 was a defined benefit plan. The ministerial pension plan, the MPP, was a defined contribution. And then from there we went into CRISP, CRSP, and then there was a revised CRISP 4 years into that. The CRISP plan basically is a hybrid of both. Now I'll tell you a secret I came to realize is I sat at a meeting of annual conference treasurers, finance chairs, and I think trustee chairs were involved in that conversation. That was being co-hosted by my agency and by the Board of Pensions, and I had the current finance chair of Western Pennsylvania ask me, what should he be watching for? And I looked at him and I says, well, the ones who are pushing for CRISPs to be based on a defined benefit program are the conferences that are overfunded under pre-1982 program. Because by federal law, you cannot use defined contributions for a defined benefit or defined benefit for defined contribution payment. So they all have to match. And when I said that, there's about three Board of Pensions agency executives standing there, and they all just kind of stopped and their mouths dropped and they looked at me and said, we never realized that. That's the politics behind this. Yep, that's the politics behind it. And on the other side, the ones pushing for CRISP to be more of a defined contribution were the ones who had already too much liability that they still owed on a defined benefit, and so they didn't want to go that way again. So ultimately, that's how we ended up with the compromise of the two, because we had annual conferences that were in both positions. If you were to go onto the our annual conference website and look at this past year's journal, to read the report from the Board of Pensions. Yes, I did that this afternoon. Don't you love Sunday afternoon in a pastor's life? Did not get to watch any football this afternoon. When you read that report, what you see is you see it say that right now, many of our plans are overfunded. But that's current year to date. What this is referring to is now, as a result of the disaffiliation, because if this congregation were to choose to no longer be a part of the United Methodist Church to disaffiliate, you have a pension liability for all those who have given you pastoral service that are still alive. And so what the Board of Pensions then at the general church level has to do is calculate out what is the actuarial age of each of these pastors based on how old they are now. The IRS has all these calculators. Every insurance company has these calculators. That's why they're willing to sell you an insurance plan, because they know how long they expect you to live. They'll go through and figure out how long they expect each person to live and what the liability is across that whole lifetime, taking into account expected inflation that may cause benefits to increase, all of those kind of factors. And so when you look at it through that longer lens, even though right now today most of our plans are fully funded, they are not fully funded to the last person dying. You see, we as long as we have Dave, you probably had pre-1982 service. So until Dave and every pastor like him die, and your spouse, we still have liability for that service. Now, if you're paying attention to what I just said and grasp any of that, and no, I'm not slamming you if you didn't, because it took me a while to get some of this too, and I've got an administration background. Defined contribution sounds like that's already fully funded. Because if you paid the 12% or whatever the percentage is, well then it's fully funded. Except when a pastor goes to retire, the ministerial pension plan requirement is that the pastor will then take 65% of that balance accumulated in that fund and annuitize it. Once you create the annuity, it is now the equivalent of a defined benefit. Because as an annuity, you're now saying every month for as long as that pastor and that pastor's spouse lives, there will be X number of dollars paid out. Guess what happens when the stock market goes down? That plan becomes underfunded. So right now, nationally, almost every pension program in the country is right on that edge of whether they're funded or not. And it has everything to do with the stock market being down. One of the reasons why I wouldn't even consider retiring right now. Because I know I get a better pension if I wait until the stock market value goes back up so that my MPP balance is better. And that's what the actuarial table would write my benefit on. So that's part of the background of that. So that's why I shared all that information, because again, I want you to understand that when we read a report in the journal that looks like, well, the amount for pro rata share of current pension liability should be 0, that it's not. That it's still a substantial number, and that number changes every day as the stock market goes up and down. And I'll say more about that. All right. The other thing 2553 gives is it does give the authority to the Board of Trustees of the annual conference to create other requirements that a church disaffiliating may need to do. So the first two are every church across the United States. The third one, our annual conference trustees have determined 2% of property value as reported on the 2021 end-of-year statistical report. That's the only additional requirement that our trustees have placed. I can tell you other annual conferences have used different numbers, higher numbers. Some have gone to full market value. Some have gone to include a whole host of other things, including if you've received any grant from the annual conference over the last 5 years, that you've repaid the grant. There's a number of other things that have been added. So in this annual conference, only 2% of the property value is the only thing added. The last one I'm adding, simply to remind us that there will be legal fees, even with a process that, if you follow the process the way it's supposed to be followed, your need for a lawyer is going to be minimum in terms of that process. I'll talk about a little bit more why you're going to need a lawyer. So you're going to have legal fees based on the decisions of what's next after a disaffiliation. So what do those numbers look like for us? Now, I've got a couple of these asterisks. The first one would be 2 years of apportionments. 52,590 would be our number. The second one, the 100,000, is an approximate. That's the pension number. I don't have a firm number from the annual conference yet, and actually no one has a firm number until the point they sign the contract. That's the point where that number becomes firm. But based on numbers that churches that have gone into this process that I've talked with to find out what their numbers were, this is about where I suspect that we would be. So could be lower, and if the market gets better, that would help, but that potentially is about where it's going to be. The 35,800 would be the 2% of our property value, and that would be off of the end of year reports, which is basically, that's the value that's declared on our insurance, is where those numbers typically come from. So we would be looking at $35,800. And then legal fees, $20,000. If we're able to do enough of the paperwork ourselves, you might get away for less than that. If it gets too messy, you might cost more than that. But again, just to kind of give you an idea of what kind of price tag comes with these decisions, potentially looking at about $208,000 for our congregation. So, next steps to disaffiliate. Oops, helps if I flip the papers the right way. All right. So our next steps to disaffiliation, then, if we were to choose to want to pursue this, with the beginning point would be a majority vote by the church, by the administrative council, that would be basically a vote saying we want to investigate the possibility of disaffiliating. Upon that vote, then I would notify the district superintendent. Part of that notification, we would have a meeting that would be scheduled with district superintendent and or bishop. Although in our case, since Jack and I attended, I don't know if they would still hold that requirement on us or not. Both of them knew we were there, so. And then we would receive our expected cost of disaffiliation, so you'd find out how close my estimates are or are not. And then we would enter into a period of discernment. The district superintendent would assist us in that discernment process as well. And then at some point then there would be a 2/3 vote. We would meet by church conference, which means we would send out letters to every professing member of the church, inviting them to come and take part in the church conference. We would seek to notify them in multiple ways to try to get best representation here. It would be 67% then required to pass a motion to disaffiliate. That motion to disaffiliate would then empower the church trustees to negotiate the final terms or the final document with the conference trustees. Now, let me say a word about that. Doug, as you're sitting here as trustee chairing, saying, oh my gosh. There is no negotiating the contract language. The contract language is the contract language because it's a national language being used. The dollar amount, the formula is the formula. So the biggest thing you're negotiating is, when can we have the dollars paid? And therefore, then when can we disaffiliate? Because you have to have the dollars paid before you do the disaffiliation. But remember, all this goes away December 31st, 2023. And then at annual conference, the approval of the disaffiliation by the annual conference. And of course, we all are assuming that that vote will be a simple, yes, it's done. And that's a majority vote of the annual conference. So for that reason, I would expect that it would be, we'll approve all the disaffiliations that come before the annual conference. Then what? Well, see, that's the issue. Disaffiliation only causes us to part the United Methodist Church. It says nothing about what's next. You see, one of the proposals that would have been considered at 2020 was actually a splitting of the United Methodist Church. But that's not what's happening. What's happening instead is a splintering of the United Methodist Church. Think about a piece of wood. You can cut it, you can break it, and it might have some rough edges, but it's going to be broken. But if you splinter it, it's in strands of various pieces. That's exactly what's happening right now, is the denomination is splintering. And so the question then becomes, because it's not a split, which means you either choose A or you choose B, it's instead, once you've gotten to the point of saying, okay, we're going to disaffiliate, while the trustees are working on that final document, the rest of us still would have work to do to say, then what's next? Do we go with the Global Methodist Church? Some are choosing to do that. Do we go with the Wesleyan Methodist Church? Some are choosing to do that. Do we go with the Nazarenes? They're also a Wesleyan-based church. That would be another option. Do we go with the Free Methodists? That'd be another option. So there are other denominations than just Global Methodist that we would be able to choose and consider. We would have to meet whatever their entry requirements are to enter in as a congregation. We would need to adopt whatever structures they require. We would need to put everything in place to make that happen. And actually, we would need to have that pretty well in place before we got to our disaffiliation date so that we could transfer property and bank accounts and all of those kind of things into the new name. Independent. Well, independent becomes even more difficult of a challenge, because as an independent congregation, then you have to determine, all right, what is our statement of faith? What do we say we believe as a congregation? What governance structure are we going to use? Are we going to have a single board that oversees everything? Are we going to have multiple committees like we do now? How do you get chosen for those committees? How do you get elected to those committees? How long is your term of office? What are your responsibilities? What's the scope of accountability and responsibility that you have? All of those pieces would need to be put into place, because you no longer have a book of discipline to tell you how to do some of this stuff. And because you're going a non-denominational route, an independent church route, there is no body out there that's going to specify that for you. So just know that if you ever considered that as a possibility, and there are churches that are choosing that, that's got its own work to it. Another one of the things that you have to think about in that model is, so where are you going to find your next pastor? What are the qualifications for your pastor? Who's going to determine whether that pastor meets those qualifications? Do you require a Master of Divinity degree? Do you recognize some other form of education as a route to ministry? Again, all of those kind of things are spelled out for us as a connected church. As an independent church, it's not. And so again, all of those are the kind of things that would have to be considered. All right. Are there any other alternatives? Yes. Stay where we are. That's one of the other alternatives. Let me share a couple of comments for you. One, I am not a member of this church. I am a pastor of this church. I am the pastor of this church until either the denomination says I am no longer a pastor of this church, or this church is no longer a part of the denomination. So I'm here. My responsibility is to be your spiritual leader, to guide you in the processes that we move forward in. I want to say, first of all, regardless of what my position is, the decision of these things is your decision. And whatever decision you choose, I will do whatever I can to help you move toward that decision, even if I think you're wrong. You know? Even if I think it's not the best idea in the world, because that's my job. And because that's what God has called me to do. To be a presence here and to help lead you into your future. That's why the discernment process is so important. That you discern that future appropriately for this congregation. Here's my concerns. I will express my concerns. And even if you chose to go forward in the process, I think you've already figured out I'm not afraid of speaking up. Because if I see something that I think is really a bad idea, I'm probably going to tell you it's a really bad idea. It's still your idea to move forward with. But I'm going to tell you it's a really bad idea, and I hope I did tell you why. Here's my concern with making the decision right now for congregations moving to Global Methodist Church. And I have a lot of good friends that are moving in that direction. In fact, I just found out that my home church last Monday night voted to disaffiliate. So I will never be able to go back to my home church as a retired pastor in the United Methodist Church, because they won't be a United Methodist Church. And I live a block and a half away is where my retirement home is. So there's some sadness to that for me. Because at this point in my life, I do not intend to leave the United Methodist Church. But my concern with going to the Global Methodist Church is not about theology as much as it is right now. It feels like for those congregations that are choosing that direction, here's a blank contract, sign the contract, and then we'll fill in the terms later. Now here's why I say that. You can go right now today to the Global Methodist Church website, and you will find on there a proposed book of discipline. You can go through and you can read all the proposed language. There are some great things, great ideas for some of the ways in which they're looking at wanting that denomination to be different than what we experience in the United Methodist Church. It's not all bad. But here's the problem. It's still proposed. There hasn't been a convening conference yet to actually approve the document. Right now, it's a committee of, I think it's 20 people, but I might be a little bit off on that number, so please don't hold me to that, that are the steering team for the Global Methodist Church, that are the ones evaluating every application from a congregation now wanting to affiliate with the Global Methodist Church. They're deciding that there are some churches that cannot join because they're not viable. Now, I don't think viability is going to be a problem for us. We're a very viable congregation. But we can look around our annual conference and see a number of smaller congregations that we would understand that they might have viability issues. When that convening conference happens, there is no guarantee that the proposed book of discipline will be approved as it's written. And that's why it feels like to me, to make that choice right now is to put out a blank contract and sign it and say, we'll fill in the rules later. And that's dangerous. Now, that has its own price to potentially pay. One of the things you ought to be aware of is that in Global Methodist Church, if a congregation does not pay its apportionments in full, that will put you on a list that will cause a conversation with the district superintendent. And if it is not cared for, the congregation will be put out of the denomination. Now, that's not a bad idea in some ways. You know, certainly as a past finance chair of annual conference, that's not a bad idea. But, you know, again, it's understanding what you're looking at, taking the time to do the research, and realize the commitment you're making. Now I'm going to speak to the other side. Yes, the United Methodist Church is broken. I'm more than happy well, I'm not happy. That's the wrong word. I am more than willing to say that, to believe that, and I believe that there are some places I could point to, just as there are places that you could point to say, yeah, this was not the idea. This was not the plan. But I also know that some of the things that we are hearing through the grapevine on both sides are not true. The United Methodist Church belief, and I'm going to show a video here in a few minutes when we wrap up, have not changed. There is a general conference process that changes to our beliefs, to our foundational documents, to our Constitution, that has to be gone through, that in fact requires not only a 2/3 vote of the general conference, but then a 2/3 vote of each annual conference. That's a pretty huge bar. And I can tell you every constitutional change that's come in the last 30 years, I would say 10% have actually gotten through the process and approved. So it's a pretty high bar for changing our core beliefs as United Methodists. And it's a time-consuming process, which, going back to Lovett Weems' comment, I believe time is on our side. It might make sense at some point for us to disaffiliate. Now, granted, this paragraph goes away December 31st, 2023. I have a hard time believing that at the 2024 General Conference, there will not be something, either an extension of this paragraph or a revision of this paragraph and then extension, that will continue to permit opportunities for congregations to leave. There are other passages that do allow other processes to be done that don't really fit the disaffiliation process in this issue, that a congregation could potentially leave with their property. And so I think that there are some advantages to waiting it out to see if, in fact, Global Methodist Church turns out to be what it says it's going to be, to see where the United Methodist Church continues to move into the future and make a decision at a later point. But again, that ultimately will not be my call. Now, I do have another video that I want to share, but I first want to just pause to give an opportunity. I know I've dumped a whole lot of stuff out tonight, but want to give you an opportunity if there are any specific questions that you would like to ask. I may or may not be able to answer them, but certainly give you the opportunity to ask them. Go ahead, Judy.
What's going to happen to our apportionments if all these churches are leaving? Who's going to pick up all that added expense from those churches that are going?
Okay, we do have the online link working tonight as a private link. Because there's a couple of folks that weren't going to be able to be here tonight that wanted to join from home. So I'm going to repeat the question to help those watching that way. So the question is, what happens to our apportionments as a result of churches leaving? By the way, anywhere you go, unless you go independent, there will be something not necessarily called apportionments that you will have to pay. Yeah, in theory, they'll go up, except here's what happens. I know that about 400 churches have launched into the disaffiliation process in this annual conference in terms of that first vote to look at it. My understanding is that only about 100 right now, it looks like, are actually moving further forward in that process. So it's not necessarily as large of a number, but to give you some concept, currently there are about 800 churches in the annual conference. One of the things that will happen is that there will be a lot of restructuring, and already is a lot of restructuring happening at every level of the church. So I think what you may find is that, of course, as churches disaffiliate, do we need 10 district superintendents? Or do we change district lines? Or maybe we keep the geographical lines, but ADS ends up with 2 districts because those 2 districts have substantially less churches than what they had before. So that would be one of the ways in which you would be able to save some dollars that way. At the general church level, I can tell you that already the general agencies have been greatly downscaling the range of services that they offer to reduce their overhead. Several of the agencies have actually, the pandemic gave this to corporate America. It also gave it to the denomination. My former agency no longer owns its own office building. It now has got part of its employees that are working from home permanently, and the ones who really can't, they have some offices in the same building that the Board of Discipleship is in, which is where the Upper Room Chapel is located. And likewise, there are other agencies that are doing some similar kinds of measurements in their work to downscale their costs. Even in terms of this past week was Episcopal elections, which were supposed to happen back in the summer of 2020. That went through its whole legal process with the Judicial Council to allow the jurisdictions, because of retirements of bishops, creating openings. I mean, our bishop and the Bishop of West Virginia have been co-sharing Susquehanna Conference as bishops for now about 3 years, or 2 years. Well, it was right after 2020, because of retirement that happened there at that time. And so this week, when bishops were elected, they elected fewer bishops than there were openings for bishops. They could have elected more, which means there are going to be more bishops doing multiple conferences as a part of that process. So again, that's another example of some of the ways in which costs will get reduced as a result. I would expect at our annual conference there would be continuing to look at conference staff. How many of those positions do we still need? How do they, do some go to part-time that are maybe full-time now and get changed around in various models? Perhaps it's a model where you might have a pastor that's part-time pastor at church and part-time doing some conference staff functions. So there'd be a variety of ways in which I think we could see that unfold. Beyond that, again, until we get to the numbers, it's hard to get to the numbers. Great question, though. Linda.
You said early on that the property is held by the local church, but held in trust by the conference. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, trust is, the trust clause is a legal vehicle that's been in place for about, well, at least all of American history, but it actually goes back even into Europe. And so what that basically means is that we do not have the power to encumber this church or to sell the property or to buy new property without going through an approval process that involves the denomination. Actually, Jack and I sit on the committee for the district that does part of that function. And so right now, for instance, we have a church on the district that is selling some parcels of land that were rental properties that they bought years ago, thinking they might want those properties. They were neighboring properties to be able to expand their ministries on. They've now come to realize that they really don't have that need and they need to get out of the rental business. So They went through the process, their church conference has approved it, and now our district committee has approved it, so that allows the DS to move forward with executing the sale of those properties. Literally, there ends up being, when the deed is filed for a new owner taking possession of a church-owned property, there will be a letter that's a part of that deed that is signed by the district superintendent and signed by the pastor as the denominational officials, saying that yes, this property has been released from its religious purposes for the United Methodist Church. So that future owners don't have to worry about anybody coming back on them at that point for the reasons of the trust existing. Part of the reason why the trust was put in place, and there are many denominations use it, it's not unique to us, is to protect the congregation from infiltration by a group of persons that come into a congregation, get into leadership positions, and cause votes to happen that suddenly a church that thought it was this denomination becomes this denomination. And that's part of the reason why the trust clause exists for that reason. It's also one of the reasons why is simply to make sure a congregation is not overburdening itself with its dreams. Any congregation that's doing a renovation that's over 25% of its current value is required to go through this approval process to do that. Any congregation that's building a new facility is required to go through that. Part of what our committee would be looking at is looking to see, have you gotten all of your permits in place? Have you got all your plans done? You know, have you got your financial plan worked out? And so it's not just about architectural, well, we don't like this style. We're not looking at that kind of thing to say, well, we think you ought to be Gothic. That's not the role of it. The role of it is more in terms of, have you done all your homework? Are you really ready as a congregation to bite this off and deal with it? So that's what the trust clause basically does.
So what entitles them to 2% of the property?
Well, because the basic unit of the denomination is the annual conference. These congregations were established because a circuit rider pastor was sent to this location to start a United Methodist, or a Methodist in those days, congregation. And so this congregation exists because of the ministries of the annual conference that planted it. And so it's a part of our polity. And that's the history behind it. Doesn't matter whether we agree with it, doesn't matter whether we like it or not, it is the history of it, and it stands up in court. Because the trust clause is a valid legal instrument. And the courts have upheld very, very few cases that have gone through anywhere in the country on trust clause and have it fail to support the denomination. So, in terms of the value, in essence, a congregation that's leaving is in essence taking something of value with them. And the other actually that's another alternative I didn't mention is we can all just walk out the door. We can abandon the property and go start community church up the road somewhere. That would be an option as well. I didn't talk about that one because it didn't really make sense to talk about it, but that's that's a possibility. And at that point, then the property becomes the conference's problem. And let me tell you, most people aren't out there looking to buy church properties. They are an asset to us while we are actively using them.
We already have one. We have a spare one.
Yeah. And it was an asset to that congregation when that congregation was alive and active and using it. And then it became a liability. Now, right now, it's a little bit of an asset because it's successfully being rented to a startup congregation that's making use of that facility and it's meeting its needs right And, yeah. But again, we're having to always evaluate whether that's a good relationship for us or not. So, other questions? Go ahead.
Well, I'm really confused with all the information. Is this happening in 2024? Or like you said, why are we putting the cart before the horse? Is it, do you ride it out and see? Like you said, because what you've said has so changed what I was thinking walking in. But I can't see if this is not going to happen. What are these churches going to do? Or what would we do? Is it money foolishly spent? What if we stay in that conference, stay in the United Methodist Church for a year? I mean, I don't think we're all going to be, a bolt of lightning is going to strike us. What are the repercussions? Is it going to be $200,000 in 2024 because shame on us, didn't go ahead and do this early? Are they going to make it very hard for us to get out of the conference then? And like I said, financially, say shame on you, we give you that option and you didn't take it. Now, it's going to really cost you double of what it did in 2022.
That's a great question, and I don't even know how to begin to capture that question.
That's what I mean.
For the recording.
I don't understand.
The issue I think I hear you raising, and I'm going to try to take it down to a simplest format. What's the advantage of moving forward and doing something now before the end of 2023? Or what is the result of waiting?
That is correct.
And as we wait, how do costs shift? The absolute truthful answer is, I have no idea whether the bill will get higher or lower.
I understand it's not a...
Here's why I believe, because that's the part I didn't say that might be helpful. Here's why I believe that the 2024 General Conference will put either a continuation onto this language or will put some other avenue into place. Because I see that as either of those as an option. All the conservatives aren't leaving the United Methodist Church right now. There are some who are leaving. There are some who are not. They are not because they still have not given up on where they believe this denomination can go. Here's another factor. Kind of goes back to an earlier comment I made earlier. How many delegates came from outside of the United States? About 44% in the years I was doing it. We're at the 2020, I think we went up to about 46, 47%. Why? Because the number of delegates allotted to each annual conference is based on a pro rata of how many members of the United Methodist Church, professing members, there are in each annual conference. The annual conferences in especially Africa have been growing in their membership, while our membership in the United States has decreased. How much of a decrease? Well, last figures I looked at, we were somewhere around, I want to say probably about 7.5 million in the United States, as opposed to when I came into ministry 30 years ago, we were at about 12 million. So we have considerably shrunk. Most of that has probably been simply by deaths. That we've recruited fewer new people in than we've lost to death. But certainly it's for others that have, for reasons of conscience or reasons of lack of relevancy in their lives, have chosen to move on from the church. And both of those are valid, I guess. While at the same time the church is growing in Africa, which means there's a growing number of percentage of the United Methodist membership that comes from outside of the United States. And the majority of that, large majority of that, is from Africa. While I will not tell you 100% of African delegates are conservative, there are a much higher percentage of delegates from Africa that are conservative and centrist than there are in most annual conferences across the United States. Southeastern jurisdiction, if we look at the United States, we divide the United States into 5 jurisdictions for the United Methodist Church. The Southeastern jurisdiction is our most conservative jurisdiction. But over time, it too has been moving more liberal than it used to be. South Central jurisdiction would be probably the next most conservative. I think it's a toss-up whether it's Northeast, which is what we're a part of, or North Central. Western is the most progressive of the 5 jurisdictions, and their behaviors have shown that and illustrated that, and also illustrated some of the I probably shouldn't have said it that way, but I did. Illustrated some of the brokenness in process. That's my issue, brokenness in process. By the way in which they've moved forward on some actions. Knowing that, I think there will still be a considerable number of conservatives voting at General Conference in 2024 that, one, will mitigate the amount of progressive legislation that does get passed, so this thing doesn't move as fast as everybody may think it will. And 2 is, again, I believe the hope for a process that is perhaps even more humane than this one, that in terms of determining price tag to leave. So that's the answer I'm going to stick with. I don't know if that helps you or not.
Just kidding.
So what's our next step?
Well, how do we facilitate getting, I mean, obviously, we are a very small gathering of interest at this point, so how do we get this information out to the congregation so they can actually comprehend it?
Well, that was the purpose of tonight's meeting. And frankly, what I'm hearing from a lot of congregations is what you're seeing represented here is there's a whole lot of others that this isn't their issue. In terms of next step, remember again, the Administrative Council is the body that really starts this process. So it would be the Administrative Council that would need to take a majority vote if they so want to enter into that. That's their elected responsibility as leaders of the congregation to move us into the process that way. So that means you'll have the chance to start bending Jack's ear if this is an important issue that you want to pursue further, to enter into the discernment processes and do that. That would be the next step. Other questions? Yes.
Another.
Go for it.
Would it be beneficial for churches, yet the other United Methodist Church in our areas, to get together and talk? You know, it's like you said, the people that are here, you know, it's not going to be one way or the other way. The people that aren't here naturally are going to have stuff to say about the decision making. But as a group with other church, United Methodist Church, just so everybody can just bounce things off of one another, you know, as to what their thinking is, and, you know, just that kind of.
It sounds good in theory. Having sat through the meeting at Harmony Zielinopol with about 9 congregations represented.
Yeah, I'm not a meeting person, I don't like
What I can tell you is that it very quickly devolves to a debate on theology rather than a matter of discerning process. The reason why this really is best done in the local congregation is because you all are in relationship with each other. others from other congregations, you may have individual relationships with some folks in other congregations, but you don't have an across-the-board relationship with that whole congregation. Well, Dave might, you know, because you guys are sitting there hopping a couple of churches. But, you know, that would be the reason why it would be problematic. And Jack and I got to see a little bit of that devolving that night in that way as well. I think the biggest, one of the concerns, I don't know if it's the biggest, one of the concerns I have in this process for any church is what happens when a church has a vote and that vote is not 80, 85% in favor one way. If it's only meeting the threshold of the 67% to disaffiliate, that means you've got a good possibility of 30% of the people walking out the door. And what are you going to do then? That raises the question of whether a congregation may remain viable. I shared with you that one pastor I've talked with on the district that thinks they're about 50-50. They have the possibility, it might not be 50% that choose to walk out the door, but again, even if it's only 20, 25, 30%, how viable do they remain? How viable are either groups at that point? Our strength is being together. And so that's, again, why the discernment process is so important, so that we go there together, so that even those who may still disagree at least have some understanding of the hearts of the others of why they want to move in whichever direction. That's the importance of that process. Other questions? Well, let me share one more video with you. This is from our bishop. As you might imagine, as I already commented about, there are folks on both sides of the issue that have been more than happy to share disinformation. Hopefully I have not done that in anything I've said tonight. So the bishop recently put out a video to kind of talk about some of the things that she's been hearing, to share information to kind of help folks to understand processes. Some of the behavior of particularly some of my clergy colleagues has actually led to a meeting being called in December for the bishop to meet with all of us, which I know is not going to be a pleasant meeting because of how bad some of the behavior has gotten. And that's the sadness, because again, if each congregation genuinely makes these decisions with proper discernment, then when it's all said and done, the best hope for us would be is that we can still find ways in which we can work together, even though we may have different names on the signs outside our churches. That would be the best thing that could happen for the Church Universal. And we look at our ecumenical relationships, what a difference it makes for the food pantry that we have relationship with other congregations of other denominations, even though we don't all believe exactly the same thing. We don't organize ourselves for ministry in exactly the same ways, but we both have concerns for those who are impoverished. That's keeping our eye on the mission. So let me share the Bishop Cynthia with you.
Beloved, I greet you in the name and with the love of Jesus, who is our Christ. I've been praying for you as a layperson in leadership in our church. I've been praying that you have been staying anchored in Jesus while you do the mission and ministry to which you have been called in your local church setting. These are interesting times in our world and in the life of the church. And as over these past few weeks I've been going around our annual conference, unfortunately I have heard a lot of misinformation about who we are as United Methodists. And so I just want to equip you with some tools to combat the misinformation that has been shared about who we are as United Methodists. I've heard in several places that the denomination is looking to or has already changed its beliefs about who Jesus Christ is and how Jesus is in the world today. Let me assure you that as United Methodists, we believe that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior, that he is fully human and fully divine. We believe that Jesus Christ is the one way to salvation. Let me say that again. Jesus Christ is the one way to salvation. We believe that Jesus Christ was crucified, that he died, and that he was buried, and on the third day he arose from the dead, so that he is a living Savior who is in the world today with us, resurrected from the dead. Now those beliefs about who Jesus is, our beliefs about who God is, that God is 3 in 1, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, those things are part of our articles of religion, our confessions of faith. And those beliefs are not easily changed. They're even not changed after some hard work. You see, they are part of our Constitution. Now, our Constitution can only be changed if the General Conference delegates ratify that change by a 2/3 majority, and then an aggregate of the annual conferences approve it by a 2/3 majority. That's how a normal amendment or change happens to our Constitution. But the articles of religion and the confessions of faith, those works that contain the fact that Jesus Christ is Lord, the fact that there's one way to salvation, and it is through Jesus Christ, the fact that Jesus Christ is resurrected, he's a living God now among us, the fact that there is one God, 3 in 1, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, those things that are part of our articles of religion and confessions of faith cannot be changed by that normal process of making an amendment to our Constitution. Those things, because of our restrictive rules, mandate that any change must be ratified by each individual annual conference in our connection by a 3/4 vote. That is 75% of the people in each annual conference must vote to change anything in our restrictive rules. If any one annual conference does not approve it by a 3/4 vote, it does not get changed. Those are restricted parts of our Book of Discipline. Further, there are no petitions, resolutions, laws currently in front of our delegates. That is, nothing was submitted for those delegates who were going to be assembled in 2020 for General Conference. Nothing was submitted that would initiate any changes in what we believe about who Jesus Christ is. So for anyone to say that we have changed or there's a movement to change, the fact that Jesus Christ is Lord and Savior, the fact that there's one way to salvation, they are giving you misinformation that is categorically untrue. So as you encounter conversations with folks about these things, I would encourage you to share with them that no, it's not true that the United Methodist Church is changing what it believes about Jesus Christ. In fact, there are not any petitions or resolutions before the General Conference at this point. Nothing has been submitted that would even put us on a path to change what we believe about Jesus Christ. And if at any point in the future there is anything submitted, that in order for our articles of religion or our confessions of faith to change, each annual conference in our connection would have to approve it by a 3/4 vote. The other misinformation that I've heard out there is that the bishops are only accountable to the bishops. Beloved, the bishops are accountable to the church, Any member of the United Methodist Church or anyone outside of the United Methodist Church can file a formal complaint about a bishop, and that complaint must be processed according to our rules as a denomination. If we need to change our rules in any way about how complaints are processed against bishops, the delegates at General Conference have the authority to do that. And so it's not the bishops who make decisions about the rules about how to process complaints against the bishops. It is the church, those folks that gather at General Conference, who make those decisions about how complaints are processed for bishops. The other myth that I've heard out there is that the United Methodist Church is not for people who have a traditional understanding of homosexuality. That is misinformation. As a denomination since 1972, we have been a home, a place for people who have a traditional understanding of homosexuality that is supported and undergirded by their understanding of Scripture. We've always been a denomination that has held in tension people who have a traditional view and people who have a centrist view and people who have a more progressive view. And those with a centrist and a more progressive view about homosexuality are not trying to push out people who have a traditional understanding of homosexuality. That pressure that some traditional congregations might be feeling to leave the denomination is coming from other folks who have a traditional understanding of homosexuality who have wanted to start another denomination. Those folks are the ones who are putting the pressure on the system. But please know that the United Methodist Church has always been a place to welcome people who have a traditional understanding of homosexuality because of our diversity as a denomination. Those are some of the misunderstandings, some of the myths about who we are as United Methodists. I hope that this video gives you some tools so that you can have conversations with people in order to correct some of the myths that might be out there so that you can give them accurate, correct information. I'm going to pledge to every week or so submit another video or some kind of written communication to you when I hear other misinformation about the denomination, so that you can have the tools, you can be equipped to have the conversations with people to correct that misinformation about our beloved denomination. I just hope that God blesses you and God keeps you as you continue to do the ministry that God has called you to do. Our Methodist movement has always been about empowering lay folks to do their unique ministry, to strengthen their gifts that they have for ministry. And so it's critical, it's vital that you feel anchored in Christ and that you are empowered to do the work to which you have been called. God bless you. God keep you. Amen.
Thank you for coming tonight. I appreciate your time. I had no idea how long we would be tonight either. I didn't want to come with we're going to be 60 minutes and out the door because I wanted to make sure that we had the time to kind of think this through and talk this through. I hope this has been some helpful information. I would encourage you to take it in your heart, your own prayers, to begin to think through where you are and what thoughts you should be about next step if we take one or if we don't. And And then as you feel moved in that process, welcome the door to you coming to talk with me or talking to Jack as chair of council, John Behe as co-chair, that you can share the thoughts of where you are in this journey. Thank you. Let's pray. Gracious God, give thanks for this night, for this opportunity to touch our lives one to another, even in the midst of a decision that could be a major direction change for us. We pray, Lord, that as we continue through thinking this through, that you might touch each one as they think through it, as they individually discern where they see the direction might be best for us to continue to go or consider going for our future. We know ultimately, Lord, that you call us to be in ministry in this place and this time, that we have a job to do right here, regardless of the name that's on our door, regardless of how we are structured, that you have called us to be the people of God in this time, in this place. I pray, Lord, that you continue to touch our hearts in that way, that marvelous things that we saw this morning with the different ministries are being supported and ministries that continue to unfold week by week, that we may make a difference. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen. Be safe on your way home.
Some of the stretched.